Okay, so welcome everybody to our online talk. We're still, as we can all see, in the comfort of our own sitting rooms, and I don't need to tell you how to get out if there's a fire. Tonight we've got Alan who's going to talk to us about the history of that lovely old house round above Crooked Corner, Beech, Knoll.
Okay, I hope you can all hear me. You may not see me. I've got John in my speaker view at the moment, but that doesn't matter. As long as you can hear me, that's the main thing. Rather relieved, actually. So, Beech, Knoll. I'm sure many of you that live in the village or have lived in the village will be familiar with this, but there could be one or two viewers who aren't familiar. This is the significant house just up from the church as you go up towards Crooked Corner and just beyond, and that's the one we'll be talking about this evening. And it's got a little bit of a mysterious origin, which I hope that we will get down to as the evening progresses. So, about 40 minutes or so, I'll outline what I found out about it and the sequence of owners, because they're almost, if not more interesting than the house itself, right through from the 17th century right up to the present day. There are some gaps in the knowledge. If any of you that lived here a lot longer may be able to add little tidbits of information, particularly over the last 50 years or so, as is often the case with some of our talks. It's more difficult to find out what's happened in the living memory than it is sometimes way back in the darker ages. If there's anything contentious, by all means chip in, but I prefer to take the questions at the end as usual. So what do we know? Well, if we go to Historic England, which looks after all the listed properties in the country, you will find that Beech Knoll is there. It was entered in 1985 as a Grade 2 house. It details all the building materials and the architectural features, all rather boring stuff, which I won't bother you with. And it also mentions the front wall, which seems to be newer than other parts. The coach house and the stables are all Grade 2 listed. And Beech Knoll's statutory address is Beech Knoll, Crooked Corner, but I think many of us might consider it's actually in Grass Hills Lane section, which of course originally ran through as a byway over the downs to Bishopston. In the Wiltshire section of the Victoria County history, that's the vast volume about everything to do with Wiltshire as well as other counties in the country, just describes Beech Knoll as a large early 19th century brick house, so not particularly flattering description. And that's about all you can find officially, but Beech Knoll does have a bit more history than that, and some of it is from local sources. I'm sure many of you remember Anne Curry lived in the village at Ford Farm until a few years back. She carried out a lot of research into the older properties and published it in the Allborn Buildings History, and we hold a copy down in the Heritage Centre. And she stated, talking about Beech Knoll, that there was an inn on the site of Beech Knoll in 1617, which is quite intriguing. House is certainly not that old. And then, as in Historic England did, Anne concluded that the house was built probably 1820 to 1840, probably just based on its style at the time. Maurice Crane, another one that people may remember, the older people in the village, he wrote the Allborn Chronicle, a very neat little booklet, which stated again that there was a Grazzles Inn on what is now called Grass Hills. An old document refers to this inn in 1617. So that's very similar to what Anne mentioned. Unfortunately, neither of them actually say where they got the information from. So that's one of our mysteries at the moment. But certainly in the 17th century, 1600s, the lane, as it indeed is today, was a busy byway to Bishopston, and it may well have had an inn of some sort there. Lots of properties in Allborn served ale, and so they could be considered pretty much to be an inn. But we have a great deal of thanks to Major Arthur Ingpen, He retired from the army and came to Albourne in the 1930s and was obviously, like us, interested in its history. And he got hold of a lot of papers from the Brown family. And he typed up a considerable amount of these documents and very handily typed a summary about Beech Knoll. That copy now sits down in Devizes Museum. And I've had a look at that, and I'm going to make a great deal of use of that in this following story. Incidentally, I may mention other names because until about the mid-1920s, the house had a previous name, Southview, and even occasionally it was referred to as South Look. So I may mention those other names at times. So here we go. We go way back to a deed of 1696, when Dorothy King and son William granted to Thomas Curtis this rather complicated bit of information that all that messuards or tenement, barns, outhouse, backside, orchard, garden, situate lying near the common pond in Albourne, the plot of meadow ground on the north side, and next unto the same messuard and orchard as is marked from the close to the north side thereof, with also the quick mound at the lower end of the same plot, and all that little close of meadows in Albourne aforesaid next Grazzles Lane. Now that's all very complicated. I don't endeavour to explain it all. At first sight, it's not clear that this might refer to property and land at the site of Beech Knoll, but hopefully this will become a little bit clearer. And just to clarify, that rather strange word, messuard, is a legal property term derived from Old French for a household, and it generally refers to a dwelling house and all its outbuildings and land. And the word tenement also refers to land. It's not necessarily just a block of flats as we might consider it in the modern terminology. We move on a few years from 1690s up to 1757. Then the Curtis people, Thomas and wife Martha, conveyed the property pretty much by the same description to William Pizzey, as that name cropping up that we're going to hear about later on in September, on behalf of John, Levi and Thomas Pizzey, all of Albourne, who were shopkeepers. And you can see these little references that Arthur Ingpen put in, where he refers to where he got the information from, which is a very good idea. And so there was a brown bundle 5, document 6 gave him that information. A few years later, John, Levi and Thomas Pizzey conveyed the property to Mark Parish, but it was still for the use of Levi Pizzey. And again, it's a similar description, the messuards and 11.5 acres. A little bit later still, obviously Levi Pizzey seemed to have died. The property became vested in his nephew, confusingly another Levi Pizzey. They often reused surnames in those centuries, really confusing when you're looking at back at the history. We move on from the 1790s up to 1809. Now this is a very important time because this is when the enclosure of Albourne as a village took place. A lot of land was redistributed to make it more economic, more practical for farming purposes. And they fortunately produced an excellent map. And the map, although the original resides in the National Archive at Kew, John Diamond obtained a very good copy, and we've kept that as a display item in the Heritage Centre for the last few years. It's amazingly detailed. I'm sure many of you will have seen it firsthand. And it does give a lot of detail about points. So here we have that. This is from 1809. All the little properties and bits of land were all allocated to various owners and occupiers, all given a nice serial number. And we can see that the area of the property where Beech Knoll now sits, and if you just to get your bearings, this is the footpath up the side of the playing area, Goddard's Playing. This is the lane up from Crooked Corner. That's as then a private road up towards Four Barrows as it is now. And so this area is pretty much where the present Beech Knoll sits. Interesting to note, this little, what appears to be a little building right on the point there. No idea what that might be. but intriguing for us interested in history. And you can see Levi Pizzey's name linked to the property here. We move on a slide, just a little bit of a close-up. You can see the layout is entirely different to the house as it is at the moment. Seems highly unlikely it's the same property, but it's likely to be this collection of outbuildings that has been handed down over the previous 100 years or so. And again, as I say, I pointed out what appears to be something just up on this corner, which is intriguing. So a few years later, October 1820, Levi Pizzey has moved out of the village. He's moved down to Letcombe, and his mortgagees conveyed the property free of encumbrances to William Woodbourne of Albourne Warren. This is Albourne Warren Farm, the one out along the Swindon Road. But on this conveyance, all the other words very similar, but this time the word malt house appears between tenement and barn. So it looks as if something has developed or has been turned into a malt house for the production of ale. So that may have a link to the fact that there was an inn there at some time in the past. William was a very prosperous farmer. In the subsequent 1837 tithe and rent survey, he owned 33 properties in Albourne, but his main farm, as I said, was out at Albourne Warren. Interestingly, 1825, there's a newspaper article, Devizes and Wilts Gazette, and here it is, there's a copy of it. Skip over the first part. Other than notices given that there's an application for stopping up and discontinuing as useless a certain footway within the parish of Albourne, leading from a certain lane there called Lottage Lane, passing through over a certain mead called Bilbridge Mead, the property of William Woodman. So I think we're referring to the property which he acquired on the site of Beech, Knoll, now in his occupation. And this footpath leads to a certain other lane called Grasshills Lane, being of a length of 128 yards or thereabouts. So he was applying to have a footway stopped up, presumably close to his property, perhaps for a bit more privacy, perhaps he wanted to expand a little bit. And on the notice, it says that this order was going to be lodged for consideration in early 1826. Unfortunately, I don't know whether this closure was confirmed or not. We think probably not, because there are still footpaths on either side of Beech Knoll. And both have lengths very close to the 128 yards, particularly, and I've pasted out, the one that runs from Lottage just by the entrance to the Knoll and the Bite catering company. If you walk that one up to the corner of Beech Cottage, it is just about 128 yards if you stretch your legs. It's very close. The other footpath, the one up by the play area, it's a bit difficult to know where that one starts because it sort of winds down towards the brook. But they're very, very similar. But it does seem to be that William was trying to make some changes. But when we get to 1837 and the tithe survey, sorry, that's a typo there, it should be a tithe survey, it still shows buildings which don't quite fit the present day layout. Here is the site. We're now a slightly different orientation. We've come up from Crooked Corner. You can go off to Four Barrows that way. This is the footpath down past the playing field. And again, this is the collection of properties of buildings still looking very similar to the Enclosure Act layout. So no great changes at that stage. There's a slight close-up, as you can see. No sign of this funny little building here, but still these properties here or bits of building. And here's William Woodman. As I say, he owned a lot of property in Albourne. This is just a selection. These are all his tenants. These are the names of the properties. And in particular, properties 640 on that tithe map is the house garden and malt house, which is described as lottage, but it's in the occupation of Charles Gould. And so this seems to be 640. That's the where we've just seen the property. It's actually occupied by Charles Gould, and the Goulds were maltsters, and it seems quite likely that they were perhaps running that malt house that was mentioned. There's certainly no signs of a fine house there in 1837. Similarly, we have the censuses with the national census, which started in 1841 and repeated in 1851. No obvious clues, nothing, no named properties in that area. And also by 1851, William had moved on. He's living down at Ham, down near Hungerford, some distance away. And a Henry Brown was by then living at Albourne Warren Farm. In 1851, there's no specific mention of anything, so maybe the property was no longer occupied. Whatever was on that site may no longer be occupied. We jump back to Arthur Ingpen's note. Very helpfully and precisely, in March 1852, William Woodbourne, then of Ham, conveyed to William Brown of Albourne the Meshwards with Malt House bounded by Grazzles Lane, and precisely number 640 and 641 on the 1837 map. So here we got definite evidence of something being conveyed to the Brown family. Pretty much the same had been over the previous 150 years. A little aside, I noticed in the Wilton Archaeological Natural History Museum magazine, of 1855, a Mr. Brown of Albourne found a small German bell dated 1550 in the foundations of an old wall at Albourne in 1854. So perhaps this is the same Mr. Brown who bought that property at Grazzles and was undertaking some work there and discovered this little bell. Well, probably his workman discovered it on his behalf. Pure speculation, but there could possibly be some link there. And then we get a definite link, because in the graveyard just to the north of the church, there's a substantial tomb inscribed John Brown, brackets, South View, died 6th of July, 1856, age 58. So it looks as if somebody was living in a property called South View. This is the first record that I've found referring to that name. So I think that it was either William who purchased the land from William Woodman, either William Brown or John Brown had the house built sometime between 1852 and the death of John in 1856, possibly around about 1854, but it's a little bit of a guess. The trade directory, they're another very useful source of information about the village, gentry and private residents, and Miss Brown is living at South View. Pardon me. And the census in 1861 very similarly lists South View, Catherine Brown, a landed proprietor. And Catherine was John Brown's widow. She was to die a few years later. And in 1871, the 10-year census, this time it says the head occupant was as Elizabeth B. Owen. That looks suspiciously like a transcription area from Brown, but we'll go with that and see how it goes. Unmarried, age 51, along with her sister Catherine Brown, also unmarried. So surely the name must be Brown for both of them rather than Owen. And there were 3 servants, so we know it was a pretty substantial property. Kelly's directory again, under gentry, Miss Martha Brown at South View, and it's the only name at that address. And then, 4 years later, Martha Brown, by then relatively elderly for her time, she died. She had been John Brown's sister. And in 1881, Southview has the head occupant, a change of name, a Joseph Hodges, a rector from East Leach. So he was probably a tenant of, as was called then, Southview. 1884, the Reading Mercury advertised the property as to let, a modern and genteel residence situated in the best part of and overlooking the town of Aldbourne, known as Southview House. And there's a bit of extra description again, which suggests it's a pretty substantial property. Another newspaper article, a couple of years later, an auction of furniture and effects to be held at Southview under the instruction of G. Lee, who's quitting the premises. So again, it looks as if G. Lee may have taken over the tenancy for a short time after the 1884 to let advert. Ordnance Survey then step into the picture. At last we've actually got a proper map, if we can call it that, although of course the enclosure map and the tithe maps are all very official. And here we have an Ordnance Survey map from 1886. Again, just to get your bearings, if you come up from the church up past Crooked Corner, and if you wanted to go up towards Four Barrows, you'd go up that way. If you head along here, you're coming along Grass Hills area. So now we've got a layout of buildings here which look totally different to the tithe map and the enclosure map. And in particular, this area here and this bit here, as I'm trying to show, are very much the footprint of the present property. It's even showing, because it's quite detailed, the little porch bit at the front, and probably some coach houses, which have subsequently become the garage part, etc. It helpfully shows P for a pump in the grounds, and even has a sundial, and I guess a representation here of the beech trees, for which the property is very obviously named these days. So this is Southview, and do note just at the front here what appears to be a little pull-in. And now thinking in terms of the time, these would be for horse and carriage, and perhaps you then could pull straight in off here, drop your visitors or whatever at the house door, and come back out again out through this little gap here. So the wall didn't appear to run all the way along the property at that time. You can still see down here the footpath down at Goddard's, and helpfully the other footpath running these days from just on Beech Cottage all the way down. There's a little bit of a zig at the bottom there, comes out on Lottage just down by where the present day Knoll is. So it's a very important map. If we move on a little bit, 1891, 1901 census both record Southview is occupied by Frederick Frampton. So another farmer who seemed to have moved in, but it's still owned by the Brown family. And again, this is a Ordnance Survey map from 1900, pretty much the same as it was in 1886, with the layout and the trees and the pump. Sundial's missing on this one, but we won't worry about that. And again, you can see the very obvious pull in and pull out exits there, presumably for horse and carriages at that time. Ignore the picture for the moment, interesting though it may be. So having owned the property since about the 1852, the Brown family sold it around about 1908, 1909. William Brown, present William Brown, communicated that to me a little while ago. But in 1910, there was a land survey, a land values survey. And if you go to the record centre down in Chippenham, you can see that the property then was still owned by the executors of William Brown, deceased, and it was occupied by a Thomas Frank Penton. But that's all I know about Thomas Frank Penton, except it's overwritten with the name J.A. Tanner. This will crop up again in a bit, but it seems that maybe a Mr. Tanner was about to buy the property. Only a year later, Southview is occupied by George Marshall Watts, who by profession was a stud manager. He left the village a little while later and then came back to Aldbourne. And there he is in all his glory over here. And he's best remembered for being the founder member of the Scouting movement. And this is a picture of the early Scouts around the cross on the green. Rather a nice picture with George suitably attired. However, by 1914, Colonel John Tanner, he'd just retired from the army after a very long and distinguished career. He'd just got married to a lady from Wokingham Way, and he'd moved into Southview, which possibly, due to that reference from 1910, maybe he'd owned the property with a view to retiring there when he finished in the service. Unfortunately, when World War I broke out, the Tanners let part of Southview to become a voluntary Red Cross depot. Very helpful. And unfortunately, after just a few months of retirement, he was recalled to the army, served another nearly 3 years, and then was killed in 1917. So a very sad tale about John Tanner and his relatively new bride. Gladys, his bride, remained on at Southview, led it to be used for quite a few fundraising events, and even held a tea party there for the demobilised men of the village once the World War I had finished and the men had returned. It's occasionally in these accounts, in the parish news, that the Reverend Jasper often refers to Southview as South Look. It may just be a typo or misunderstanding. It never seems to have had that name officially, if I can put it that way. In the summer of 1920, there was a fete at Southview. Lots of activity. You could have played golf, clock golf, fortune tellers, bowling for a duck. There was a fairy play and a baby show and dancing to the Allborn band in the evening. So a very pleasant and sociable occasion, and being held in the grounds of Southview. But 1921, Gladys Tanner remarried. She sold Southview and moved back to the Wokingham area. This is a 1925 Ordnance Survey map, again still showing the familiar layout that we'd seen in 1886 and around about 1900. But notice a difference here. We now seem to have a complete wall along the front here, perhaps much as it was today, which suggests that there's been a change in the actual layout. If I can just hop back one, I'm not sure I'll do that. I'll try not to be clever. Anyway, once Gladys had left, the Reverend and Mrs. Faber took up the property, and it does look as if they changed its name. Constance Faber died in 1925, and the news in the parish news, Allborn Parish News of that October, a sudden unexpected death of Mrs. Faber of Beech, Knoll. That's the first time that I've found that name mentioned in the local records. And it also appeared in her will, which was published in 1926. And the Reverend Faber died just a few months later, but he'd already left Allborn by that time. May 26, we have new owners, occupiers. Mr. and Mrs. Gascoigne have taken up residence at Beech, Knoll. And the village gave them a hearty welcome to Allborn. Now, George Gascoigne, he was quite a respected artist and engraver, and so was his wife, Ethel, and she was a painter. Their work occasionally appears in auctions and is quite sought after these days. They quickly joined in Allborn life. Ethel was running her Bible classes, and George coached and provided cricketing gear for the lads. So they were well into Allborn life very, very quickly. They even hosted the annual dinner for the all-born ex-servicemen's men's group in 1928. That used to be held in the Crown, but for some reason that year they couldn't. So the Gascoignes allowed them to hold the dinner. It's quite a substantial dinner in their house. Sadly, George died 1933. Got a mention in the Times when he died. And Ethel appears to have moved on quite soon after that, because Gerald and Joyce Finzi bought the house in 1933. Gerald, a composer of various genres of music, especially choral works, and as some of you know and may have read in the Dabchick that Warwick Hood has written about, has quite a notable interest in his work in recent years. Particularly on Classic FM has introduced it, and he seems to become very well known in recent times. And incidentally, the Finzes they bought a piece of land adjacent to Beech Knoll in 1935 for the princely sum of £68, and they sold it in 1939 for £60. Very generous of them, and they sold it to Lady Curry of Upham House, who immediately gifted it to the parish, as was her wont, and that's what we now call Goddard's Lane Play Area. So courtesy of the Finzes and courtesy of Lady Curry, that area has become under the ownership of the parish council for the last 80 odd years. Moving on again, Finzes left Beech Knoll just before the outbreak of war in 1939. And then in December 40, another newspaper report, the Red Cross sale had been held at Beech Knoll, Mrs. Heath's residence. Unfortunately, I've not found anything out about Mrs. Heath. No idea who she is, but perhaps one of you listening, viewing this evening, or somebody else may know who that Mrs. Heath was. Because we believe that all or part of Beech Knoll was requisitioned for at least part of World War II for military accommodation, probably especially during the training period when the 101st Airborne was in the area. But it may have been used at other times because there were other military units here earlier on in the war as well. So a little bit of a mystery during the wartime period, which would be quite nice to get a bit more detail on. However, a bit more fact, in 1946, Lieutenant Colonel Spencer B. Horn, Military Cross, retired from the army, and he and his wife bought Beech Knoll. Now, Spencer had had a distinguished military career, and he's of the age where he'd fought in the First World War and, of course, the Second World War. And in the First World War, although he started off in the army, he ended up in the Flying Corps, and he was regarded as a flying ace. In other words, he shot down at least 5 aircraft. And he is the chap on the left in this picture. That's Captain Spencer Horn. And then in later life, unfortunately, he was dragged in again for the Second World War and served again, spending a lot of his time in India. Rumour had it, Spencer Horn kept a tiger at Beech Knoll. Maybe, hopefully, a stuffed one, perhaps a souvenir of his time in India. Not the sort of thing that would be particularly PC these days. In 1954, Parish Magazine, the annual band fete took place in the ground of Beech Knoll, kind permission of Colonel and Mrs. Horn. And in 1958, they hosted a tea for church members and the children. So the property, again, just like it was in the 30s and the 20s, was often used for social events for the village. And the Horns lived there quite a long time, because they moved in 1946, still there in 1969 when Spencer died. As far as I know, the next occupants were Andrew and Kate Kimpton. Andrew, managing director of a honey merchants, did a lot of travelling, and there's quite an extensive profile of the family in October '73. From the wording, it looks as if they may not have actually decided to settle in Albourne, but they were there until probably 1986, when they sold to the present owners, Richard and Joan Price. Now, of course, I've met frequently with Richard and Joan in the last 2 or 3 years when I've been researching Beech Knoll. Unfortunately, perhaps surprisingly, they don't know much about the history, and they unfortunately don't hold the deeds of the property at present. The whereabouts are unknown. And of course, they'd be invaluable if we had the deeds going right back to those very early 17th century ones. It would give us a greater insight. Although we've got snippets through the brown papers, we may not have the original deeds. And just to bring us bang up to date, this is a satellite photograph of the area. And again, just to try and get your bearings, here, this is about where the footpath runs up at the side of Goddard's Lane playing field. This is a footpath up here, running up to the junction with the track to Four Barrows. This is along the front. Here's the main property sitting here, obviously with the big beech trees occupying the view, and the cottages along here, Beech Cottage at the end. And again, the just out of view here, sorry, the outer view is Beech Cottage, and the track, the footpath that leads down to just at the bottom of the knoll. You can just see a little bit of it here, and then it disappears. And this area of land at the bottom of Beech Knoll was sold off a few years ago, I believe, by Richard and Joan, and that allowed the properties of the knoll to be built in this area. And interestingly, this is where Gerald Finsley had a very important apple orchard. He was very keen on his apples, and he had prize specimens there. Unfortunately, pretty much all of those disappeared when the knoll was developed in the, I believe, the early 90s in this area. So the property now generally occupies a small area. It still runs from the track by the footpath by Goddard's playing fields, and it runs right through. Lastly, another slight aside, when the Heritage Group started in 2013 with the metal detecting survey, the metal detecting people, detectorists to be officially titled, they did a survey on the triangular pagoda in front of Beech Knoll, and they found a remarkable collection of goodies, for want of a better word, which we now hold in the Heritage Centre. So that small piece of land yielded quite a few things to do with bells, medals, coins, guns, all sorts of things. So showing something of the history of that particular area. We obviously didn't go and dig up Joan and Richard's nice lawns, but love to really, but they probably won't let us do that. So that's been a bit of a trip through. Just to summarise, there's probably been a property on the site since the early 1600s, 1617, it could have been an inn. It was certainly there in the 1700s and the 1800s and the 19th century, including a malt house. And these were probably replaced around about the 1850s by the present house, which was originally called South View. And then the name changed to Beech Knoll about 1922. So as I say, at the moment, there's still some loose ends on the research. So we regard this as very much work in progress. And if any of you got any extra information, I'd be very interested. I must thank Joan and Richard for their help, and other people who've contributed tidbits of information, although Arthur Ingpen's papers at Devizes were a main source, and so the maps down at the Record Centre and the British Newspaper Archive, which is always great for little social snippets from time to time. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to try and answer any questions. And over to you. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Alan. Can you unshare your screen?
I will try and stop that.
Yes.
Not being very clever.
That's it. Okay, now we can get back to see people. All of a sudden my screen has changed organization here. I'm just looking back through the chat to see what we have. We've got a question from Rachel. Would the deeds of the houses on the Knoll have some of the info on the site from earlier when they were part of the main property? I think...
well, I would have thought not, in the sense that there was nothing there beforehand. There is no history of the houses sitting on that site, so why might they have anything? I stand corrected, but I wouldn't have thought that they would have any reference. There might have been some conditions laid down from the previous deeds, some sort of covenants or other things to stop them doing things like keeping pigs in the garden or something. But I wouldn't have thought there was anything to relate to what went before. No. Sorry, Rachel, don't know.
Right, that's all the questions that we have from the chat. I've got something that I'd like just to pick up on for you. You were talking of the 1871 census and the Miss B. Owen,
yeah,
who was there. I'm going to share my screen a moment. I can work out which bit I want to share. It's that bit. Here is the 1871 census document. And if we
that definitely says
enlarge that, you can see here, if it's a reading, then it's a misreading by the enumerator. Yeah. Because in the enumerator's book here of the census, it's quite different, definitely a B. Owen.
Yeah.
No, it's not. That says Brown.
And Catherine ditto as his sister.
Yeah.
But this would have been made up from the enumerator's notes, so it's quite possible that he actually misinterpreted it.
Yeah.
It says Brown.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear somebody saying it's Brown. I'm sure it probably is, but the mistake was made 150 years ago. Right, does anybody else have a question?
I have
Please.
one, John.
Sorry, I heard a male voice first.
Me, Terry. It's
Terry.
Yep. It's not a question, but the lovely picture of Marshal Watts with the Scouts. They were sat on the cross on the green, and I can name all of the boys on that picture, but I don't know in which order. in the 1980s, when I was a Scout leader, I had a picture of the then troop in exactly the same position, and I'm pleased to say I do know who all the boys are.
Okay, who else has a question?
Yes, Alan. Robert Todd. You have mentioned through your talk about Grass Hills Lane. We moved here in about 33 years ago, and we bought number 3 Grass Hills. Now it's over the years has changed to Grass Hills Lane. Do we know where we live? The road sign says Grass Hills. We're just rather confused about it.
Yeah, I suppose I've used the word lane with a small L just to point out that it isn't principally the lane. I think that's what in most people's mind springs to mind, that it is a lane, it's a byway. No, I wouldn't like to think that I've moved you in any way there or confirm that you're in the lane. But yeah, just the signboard, I agree, just says Grass Hills or Grazzles as it was over 300 years ago. Certainly it's interesting that the name has really not altered that much in 300 years. So it's surprising it hasn't totally disappeared, but it's rather good. It's very good. But and yet the house, as I say, Beech Knoll, its postal address is crooked corner, which it seems a bit removed from physically being on that crooked corner.
Crooked bit.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Yes, am I right in thinking that the Grazzles, with a Z, is in fact just the Wiltshire accent for grass hills?
Yes. The earliest written reference that I've seen is from the 16th century, when it was written with a Z.
Yes, but
as Grazzles.
Yes, that's just a transcription of the way it was pronounced, I assume.
Yeah, I think it seems very reasonable. It was always in the local terminology, grass hills, but the accent gave it Grazzles to whoever was writing it down. There have been so few people who could have written at that time, perhaps. Yeah. Well, thank you.
A lot of place names like that were always known in their dialectic form, and they only became standardized into something resembling standard English with the Ordnance surveyors in the early 19th century. So I'm afraid, Eric, I'm rather of the opinion that it's originally Grazzles and it's been standardized to grass hills rather than the other way around.
Well, it doesn't seem easy to determine between those interpretations.
Do we have any more questions?
Does it mean if the light's gone out, does that mean you've switched yourself off?
In that case, I have one more question, although it's not about Beech Knoll. There's a question here from Paul, who asks Alan, will the walkabout quiz be as fiendish as last year? If so, he'll set aside 3 days.
We will try our hardest to make it as fiendish. No, we were conscious there were some tricky questions last year, but we tried to cater for all ranges. So yeah, there'll be some easier ones as well. Last year we tried to keep the route to roads where there was a footpath. That's a bit limiting in some areas, and we missed some quite interesting potential clues. I think this year we may well include 1 or 2 of the roads that don't have a footpath alongside of a pavement, but which have some interesting opportunities. I mean, the Butts is okay because that's not a busy road, but the stretch down Marlborough Road towards the square, we avoided that. But again, just where Paul lives, there could be some potential very good questions had in that area. So we'll see what we do. Deletta and I will be working that out. We've already got a few questions lined up. We'll be doing a bit more over the coming couple of months. Yeah, thank you.
Right, well, thank you all very much. Thank you, Alan, for the time that you spent in researching that and for giving us such a really good and detailed review of the history of that house.
Thank you.
That's the end of this recording. If you want to see more recordings of other talks, please go to the address shown on screen. Thank you.